Again, studio, this time about different forms of disorder that can actually be part of your work or work with banks. Of course, there is a whole lot of history with banks and me, but also different forms of expression when you think about that. Empathy is also some sort of very difficult form, but also paranoia if you have slightly more fortune. Or you are coding for the banks. Of course, completely disorganized if you are also making simple concepts, but also to think about when you think or see different forms of voices, what that even is. From different forms of disorders, also, can that heal schizophrenia or different forms of disease that actually exist? But also to think about different forms of the symptoms or how to heal other disease if you know for any. To understand different forms of disorders, it's not easy, but also to understand doctors, it's not easy. And some people even think that doctors are insane. To understand psychiatrists, it's also not simple because they are extremely unnatural. Of course, it's not easy to understand different forms of fiction figure like me, but also to understand different forms of psychopaths that are among the doctors or bankers. To understand different forms of the book me offer for the doctors, it's also not easy because are partly made of fiction. Also to understand psychology behind the simple insurance, it's not easy, but also can the story actually heal some people? To understand different forms of the theory, but also to understand community, it's not easy because the 20% of community might actually have some criminal history. Now you can understand the community, it's not easy. And if you think about Bonnie or Clyde and their story, of course, it's extreme, very difficult story to think about, but also very psychology if you think about book or how you could develop some sort of ethics out of that. You must have some problem so you can think from more critical point for every point in your life, or to think about very critical about the community and how it could develop or what sort of nonsense the community could also develop if not enough simple. Of course, it's not easy to make those type of coding interactions, but also some sort of coding interventions, but also to build some sort of simple public health. It's not easy to build simple specialized agency with some models that actually live healthy life and 0% of crime. Of course, that is only possible with 21 plus, and you actually work for under 21 only simple gaming, but not more. For 21 plus, of course, you can also build more accounting, but also different forms of healthcare together with different forms of organization. United healthcare really is difficult if you are working with different forms of doctors. To understand simple forms of health in life, it's also not easy if you are messing together with different forms of models. To do some contributions, it's not easy in life, but also it's not easy to lead any insurance company because are extremely complex. To understand health, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to understand psychology together with the different forms of well, there are structures, the guides, but of course in health, sometimes insurance it's also the most accurate when it comes to some forums. To understand the type of programs me made for different forms of people, it's not easy. And of course, prevention of crime in medicine is actually very important thematic for me. And me even compare it with Bonnie and Clyde strategy. Of course, medicine professionals might not agree with me because they might think that me is extremely difficult, but let's think about dentistry together and you'll see there is millions of mistakes that actually doctors do. To understand different forms of audiology is very important, but also simple nursing also training for some doctors, but to build better health Taoism professionals. Of course, secondary care is also important, but not only the first therapy. To understand different forms of health care, it's not easy, and of course, not all people that are working in technology understand that. Of course, there is some illness also among the people, and you should actually build some conditions if you are working in health sector. Health sectors are a lot of time very difficult, and all those sectors are sometimes even international community, but not always. Sometimes you must understand simple forms, but also slightly forms of the abstractions. The abstractions also told us that there is a lot of problems in different forms of community, and there are a lot of trouble. It's not easy to understand different forms of psychology when it comes to different forms of simple words. Actually, in medicine, there are millions of very difficult words. But if you think about from the form of ethics, they are really a fiction. And of course, they are all coming from Latin language, which is extremely difficult, but also unacceptable for me because me think that that's slightly extremely old language. Of course, if you are professional on Latin words, of course, you can also find some meanings behind that. Abandoning medicine is not possible because it's too developed. And of course, you cannot argue with different forms of professionals. But you can charge for your time or your products, of course, which is extremely logical in business world. To understand simple forms of abstractions, but also on absurd forms together with simple forms of reality, it's also very important together with different forms of what you think the philosophy is. To agree with different forms of the terms insurance, it's not easy for everyone, but for some people, for some category, for some experts, some things are very logical and some things are not very logical. And of course, in medicine, there are a lot of very specialized words that are extremely ethics. But if you are looking from more natural point of view of English, of course, you should build more simple words also humans can understand. So, if you think about professionals or simple forms of doctors, they are also some sort of evil. So if you see that form of evil, you can actually make different forms of citations for professionals also. To build some forms together, it's not possible. That's why every human should actually make statement for themselves. Of course, different forms of statements are some sort of extreme treats for doctors or Taoists that are actually leading different forms of community, but also to understand that 20% of philosophy is actually health. That's very important if you think from the health perspective. Me also did think if the rhymes could actually heal, and surprising fact that English could heal for real. It's not easy to understand different forms of category together with people, but also the history. And me usually think about different forms of abstractions. You can also check those top 20 paintings of Picasso and also think, could the arts really heal? And of course, if arts could heal, that might change your opinion about different forms of professionals in history, but also what is possible to live with, to understand different forms of buttons together with different forms of entering medicine. If you think about that, it's also not easy. A lot of people might be misguided from some point, but they might also see the wrong statistics sometimes. And from point of simple information, it's very important to understand some top editors, but also different forms of abstraction when it comes to different forms of health. To understand cinema is also important, but not extreme important if you are a medicine professional. You don't need to understand everything if you want to become more and more expert, because you must know one thing. There's millions of experts around the world, and if this world is Africa, of course, not even one expert is perfect. They all have some mistake. So that's one of the problems in this simple world. To understand different forms of Bonnie and Clyde, you should actually look those 20 Picasso paintings. And are you actually able to make something like that? Because when you look at those different forms of paintings and sculpture, and it's some sort of extreme fancy art, it's very, very difficult to make a picture like that. But if those pictures could heal, that is not easy to think about that. If picture could actually heal, that would be some sort of superior form of healing.